Hey everyone, welcome to the Shake Me Awake podcast with Jen. It's taken me 40 years to finally wake up to my true potential, my authenticity, my purpose, and my passion in life. I can't go back to sleep, and I want you to wake up with me. Every week we'll be talking about the journey of opening your eyes to the life you were meant to lead, how to show up as the real you in this one life we've been given, how to live more authentically, and how to find your true purpose instead of sleepwalking through life like so many of us are doing. I want you to wake up every day filled with purpose and passion and show up as the true you, because otherwise, life is exhausting. I am committed to living each day authentically and with true purpose, and I want you to join me. Follow this podcast and visit my website at shakemeawake.com. Be part of a community of people who are done sleeping through life. I'm so excited to share this podcast interview I did recently with someone I found really influential so far in my podcast journey. His name is Andrew Petty, and he has an amazing podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying. I met him at my first podcast conference before I had even recorded a trailer, and the conference was a wonderful experience. And when I met him, I learned he had a podcast that revolved around something that had been really heavy on my mind, which is death. What are we living for, if not with one eye on our own mortality and making sure we're doing everything we want to in life? On Andrew's podcast, he explores this subject, and he challenges us to face our own mortality. He talks to so many people who are living this way daily, and many of them who literally face their own mortality in some real way. Andrew's podcast challenges us to live like we're dying, because we all are, and we should live the lives we're made to live, as he says in his intro. I truly believe this is one of the most important things we can be asking ourselves every day. What would I do differently with my life if I knew I was dying? Because we all are. Hello, Andrew. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Good to be here with
Great.
you.
Thank you for being here.
How are you?
I'm doing great. The weather has been beautiful. You're actually the first person I have interviewed that is in my own state. So
And where are you exactly? I don't remember.
I'm in Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs. Okay. So it's probably getting close to springy feeling there, huh?
Well, we're supposed to get snow Thursday and Friday, which is spring in Colorado. So,
Exactly. That's first spring, then second winter, then second spring, then third winter. Yeah.
right. Then false spring, false summer, actually. Yeah. I have a
Yep.
Jeep, and it's really hard to ever get to the point where you can actually take the doors off.
Right.
I don't
With
think that
confidence to leave
happens.
them off.
Yeah. I don't think that happens until July or August.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. Well, thank you so much for being here. I want to start out talking a little, just introducing how we met, because that was a very synchronistic thing for me. And it was right at the beginning of me deciding to start this podcast. I hadn't even really formulated exactly what I wanted it to be like, but I knew that I wanted it to be something about living life to the fullest. And so I started listening to a woman who does some coaching on abundance and living the life of your dreams and living authentically and all those kinds of things. And at the end of one of her programs, she said, "We're going to do a podcast." And I absolutely could not think of anything to do. So I didn't do the assignment, which for me, an A+ student, was really hard and kind of a letdown to myself. Um, but anyway, fast forward a couple months, and she offered a podcasting program. And by then I had done enough kind of soul searching and thinking about that whole thing, about why I couldn't make myself do that podcast project. And I decided, you know what? I'm just going to join her program and see what it's all about. So before I even started
Can
her
I ask a
program,
question?
yeah.
So to be clear, the end of this program that you went through with her was to create a podcast.
Well, the first program was just about abundance.
Gotcha.
And at the end, she just did a little experiments to kind of break us out of our shell, an experiment to break us out of our shells, and told us, hey, you're going to start a podcast, just to start one, just do one episode, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't think of
Yeah.
anything to talk about. I didn't think I had anything to offer the world, even after this whole program on abundance that I had just been through. But this was something new that to anything I had ever done in my life. I've spent 20+ years working in government, not doing anything creative or with my gifts or with my passions or anything like that. So 3 months later, I'm still kind of kicking myself that I didn't take that opportunity and just start it while I was in the class, while everybody was there to help and all those sorts of things. So 3 months later, I said, okay, I signed up. I'm going to go ahead and sign up for this program about starting a podcast. So this was the point at which I had signed up and I was going to commit to starting a podcast. Before I even started the program, I started researching podcasts about podcasting so that I could start to kind of get some information. I'm a researcher anyway. And the very first one I listened to was talking about going to a podcast conference. And that podcast conference happened to be happening 2 weeks later in Denver, 40 minutes from where I live. So I ran home, talked to my boyfriend about it, and he was like, let's do it. So I signed up for the conference, and that's where I met you. And I met so many amazing people there, so many people that were incredibly supportive, so willing to talk to me, as a total newbie, didn't know my butt from the microphone. And were willing to give me tips and be on my podcast like you. Um, and so that was just such a wonderful experience. And even more synchronistic was I sat down at one of these random meetings that they organized at this conference, and you were sitting across from me, and we all went in a circle and explained what our podcast was about. I had literally come to terms with mine maybe the week before, and I had come up with the name Shake Me Awake. And what it symbolized for me was finally waking up in my life to realizing I hadn't been living the life that I wanted to live. And that I hadn't been using my gifts or my talents or living authentically or my passion or my purpose. And all of that kind of spun out of this thought that kept gnawing at me, which was essentially, we're all dying. What would we do if we got told today you're going to die 6 months from now? I know you talk about 5 years, and that makes more sense to me for a lot of reasons. But in my head, I kept thinking, how could I get people? I was even thinking about like living funerals,
Mhm.
where like we celebrate in kind of a morbid way. If I were dying, how would I feel about it? How would my friends feel? What would I want people to say about my life? What would I want my kids to say about the life that they watched me lead? So all of that long beginning to say, then you started talking about your podcast, and I was absolutely blown away. So please tell us a little bit about that.
It's called Andrew Petty is Dying. And it is an attempt to, through stories, interviews, and short form solo episodes, equip people with the mindset and the means to live their lives with guts, gusto, and abandon by embracing the mortality mindset, which simply means courageously and voluntarily integrating daily awareness of our mortality into our daily lives, into the everyday fabric of our decision making, our priorities, our allocation of time and energy. And I've been doing that almost for 4 years. Come April 3rd, I think it'll be 4 years. And it's been a fantastic experience. I have a small following of very consistent listeners, whose ears have been pricked by what we're talking about, what we're trying to do. And I'm very grateful for their time, trust, and attention. What I've been probably most surprised by is how it's changed me. It has been a consistent sort of self-curated learning experience. I've thought often, because it's not monetized in any significant way, I've thought often, what I spend the couple $100 and the time and energy each month for the past few years today, knowing now what I didn't know then. It's only been really, strictly speaking, an expense on my books. And the answer is a resounding yes, because the process has changed me. And I'm someone who has a long history of initially pretty debilitating anxiety starting in my 20s. And it happened to be around catastrophic health events and mortality, especially. That was the thing that this roving animal of anxiety inside of me decided to latch onto because of a few particular events. And so over the course of the 4 years that I've been actively pursuing cultivating the mortality mindset for myself, figuring out more and more what it is and how we do it and how it makes a difference. It's been a form of exposure therapy for me that has substantially healed me from at least that form of anxiety. And I would say from the anxiety, capital A, uh, almost completely. So that's what I've been attempting to do. It's taught me a lot. I've learned a lot. I would certainly do it again.
You know, I've heard you say in your podcast that you're an introvert, and that's something I have struggled with and sort of I'm starting to learn maybe used as a shield a little bit to say, oh, I'm an introvert. I can't do that. I wouldn't do that. That's not something I would enjoy. And I'm finding that this medium is so wonderful for me. Um, Not to say I don't dread every single episode until the moment I start talking to the person, then I'm having the time of my life. Um, so I completely understand what you're talking about with the anxiety. And it's interesting that people like us who feel that way can show up for this and put our voices out there. But it really has been very therapeutic for me. Um, and I think it has, I told someone else, it's almost like introvert therapy.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
No, please, anytime.
I work with people and their personality styles quite a bit. It's one of my favorite things to do. And it's very common that I hear introverts refer to their introversion as if it is a disease or an acute and chronic illness that they need to get over. And it makes sense. I think we live, broadly speaking, in a fairly extroverted culture where people who are stereotypically extroverted, sort of out of front, like having the spotlight on them, um, maybe have a lot of words and speak them rather loudly. That would be very broadly stereotypical. Those sorts of personalities tend to be, I think, esteemed, generally speaking, more than others who are quieter, fewer words, slower to speak, quick to listen. And I just hope you'll be willing to consider that introversion is not a disease. It's an innate characteristic, and your introversion has tons of hidden powers within it. So the degree that you've considered your introversion a disease, I hope you'll disabuse yourself of that notion. Here's the prescription. I'm handing it to you through the camera.
I love it.
Introversion is just a personality preference. And it's neither good nor bad, right nor wrong. It's just a matter of how we understand it and how we take steps then to deploy it in the world based upon that understanding.
Yeah.
And I am an introvert and have, through my own personal work and working with clients, just come to appreciate what it takes for me as an introvert to uh, be available and well fueled for the non-introverted moments that are important to me and where I want to show up well, which typically for introverts means quite a bit more time to ourselves doing what we want, where we want, with no one else around. And it takes a variety of different forms. So it's
Absolutely.
different ways of managing, conserving, using, replenishing energy. It's interesting to me too that you said you dread these conversations just up until the moment that you start doing it. And
Yes.
I can relate to that. And I used to have all kinds of notes and things written down. These happen to be notes about you and your show and everything, but um, prompts to remind myself of this, that, and the other. And then over time, I've slowly realized that the value of these kinds of conversations is the genuine exchange between two people genuinely seeking to move themselves further down the road through the exchange itself.
Mm.
And when I'm able to take my eyes off of myself and my self-consciousness and really engage with the other person, um, tends to produce a much better result for me in terms of enjoyment and for the listeners in terms of the content of the conversation. So if you're willing to consider that the asset that you bring to the podcast conversation is you, not your experience, your lack of experience, your skills or lack thereof, but your desire to pursue deeper understanding of how to conduct ourselves well in the world to get good results with our lives, then that's the real thing. That's the real currency.
I love that. Oh, I love that so much. And I know that a lot of the people who listen to my podcast right now, because it is small, and I appreciate you saying that about, lack of experience. And obviously that's something that makes someone like me very nervous about putting something like this out into the world, but everybody has to start somewhere. And,
Yeah.
the journey that I'm on has taught me and has encouraged me to just jump and just show up. And the other thing I'm working on is, with the introversion thing, is seeing that as just a heart-centered. I, I'm I see myself as an introvert, but it's because I enjoy more moments where I can be more coming from the heart.
Hmm.
And I get nervous in moments where I'm expected to quickly come from the mind. And
Hmm.
for some reason, I have it in my head that extroverts are quick. They're quick
Hmm.
thinkers and they're quick in the mind. And I'm just a little slower, like you said, and I'm deeper in the heart. That's where the things that I like to put forth come from. And so I'm trying to, you know, as I go along this journey, and we're going to talk about the hero's journey because I absolutely love what you're doing in that with that and in that arena, is I do kind of, I've used this metaphor before, but I feel like I'm putting things in my pack as I'm going along my journey, and the things that I want to take with me and the things that I want to bring into this business that I'm hopefully building. So yeah, I love that. It does feel like permission to do it differently and to show up just as who I am. And I hope that I get to the point, because right now, I'll be perfectly honest, I have my Zoom notepad up in front of me because of the very same reason. I'm so nervous about forgetting what I wanted to talk about. But I've listened to so many of your podcasts that I feel very comfortable with the material. So it's a crutch. I've got it there as a crutch. So
I think preparation has its time and its place. I interviewed someone recently who's an author of 7 books, and he's the first figure with that much public prominence that I'd interviewed. And I realized I need to know where this guy's coming from, what his central thoughts are. And he's getting ready to release a new book. And so being on my show was a way for me to serve him as he released his book. And so I did a lot of preparation. I read a book over the course of a weekend, took pages of notes, and just sort of soaked in him and what he was about so that I could show up, I think rightly and respectfully prepared to engage him and to serve him and to find ways that serving him also meant serving my audience, because both are responsibilities of mine. And my experience has been that over time, as we continue to prepare for these conversations, we learn what's useful and what's not. And sometimes having notes is useful. Sometimes it ends up being a distraction because you're trying to make sure you're hitting all the things as you go
right.
along, and which keeps you from being genuinely engaged in the conversation. So it just takes, this is what you're doing right now. You're putting in the reps. And as you put in more reps and get more comfortable and figure out what it is that you like, who it is you like talking to, what it is you like talking about. And as you learn from that very process itself and your own thinking is refined, because that's been, I think, one of, if not the biggest gift to me, is going through these reps over the past 4 years. And I've only released every 2 weeks. So it hasn't been, I mean, I'm on episode 98 and I'm not nearly the number of episodes that many people are. It's allowed me to refine my thinking, and to figure out what I think. And
Mhm.
then consequently, how then I want to live based upon how my thinking is evolving. And I trust you'll find the same to be true. So it's immensely personally valuable. Yeah.
Yeah,
Keep
absolutely.
going. Keep going.
Well, thank you. I plan on it because I really do enjoy it. And I love all the different people I've gotten to talk to, all the different people I've met, people I never in a million years. My last podcast was with a woman from Scotland who I never would have met or had the opportunity to speak with. And she's absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And, it's just been such a blessing to get to meet all these people and talk to them. And this is really the most supportive community I've ever been around,
Huh. Interesting.
the
That's
podcasting
cool. I'm
community.
glad you're
Yeah.
finding that. Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of the hero's journey, talk a little bit about that.
The hero's journey is a framework for understanding another word for it is the monomyth, the one story that seems to appear in all of the most cherished mythologies, across all the different cultures in humanity over time. And the man who kind of assembled this framework and called it the hero's journey was Joseph Campbell, most notably in his book, Hero with a Thousand Faces in the 20th century. And then in the late 1900s, I think it was late 1900s, a Disney story exec happened upon that book and realized, because Disney was floundering big time, just tanking, show after show, movie after movie was tanking. And he stumbled upon that book and realized, oh, this is the one story that we all somehow innately deeply resonate with. And that's why it's persisted over all of history, is because this is what we value as humans. And it appears to be the essential blueprint for living a life we can be really proud of and living well. And it's a life of capital A adventure. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But he went back to his writers. He created this manifesto overnight, went to his writers and said, look, this is the story we're going to tell. The characters can change, the setting can change. It can have twists and turns that meander all around this framework, but ultimately this is the story. And essentially it is the unsuspecting hero living in their status quo. So think Bilbo or Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings, living in the Shire, their peaceful life of beer, 7 meals a day, and smoking their pipe. And then they are confronted with an adventure. And typically in all the stories we come to know, whether in book or movie form, it's an involuntary adventure that's thrust upon the unsuspecting soon-to-be hero. And immediately they're confronted with the decision, oh my gosh, this adventure is here. So in Lord of the Rings, this ring has to be delivered to Mordor, and I'm just a hobbit and I'm 4 foot tall, and how am I going to do that? And immediately you begin resisting the call. And then a mentor shows up. And in the oldest mythologies, very often the mentor is a supernatural figure, a divine figure. Gandalf was sort of like that in Lord of the Rings. But it can be in our lives, it can be a literal mentor. It can be a father, anyone who comes along and says, hey man, or hey gal, you got to go on this adventure. Come on. And they pull you past, they help you get through that resistance and cross this threshold. Now you're on a new adventure. Think Frodo or Bilbo leaving the Shire. They pass, in one of the movies, they even say, I've never been farther than this. I think they're passing a fence line or something. And so in physical terms, they were crossing over a literal and figurative threshold, going into the land of the unknown that was full of uncertainty. It's a special world where special things will happen, but not without quite a bit of hardship. Then they enter this underworld and they meet allies, they meet enemies, they have trials and tragedies, they have triumphs. And there's ultimately this test, this ultimate test that often is characterized by literal death and rebirth or some sort of internal and spiritual death and rebirth. And when the hero perseveres and summons the requisite courage, they overcome that challenge and then begin this slow journey back home.
Mm.
And now they are in possession of treasure that they didn't have before. In the case of the movies and stories we know, often it's a literal treasure, a tangible treasure. But always, even if there is a tangible treasure, there's an internal treasure that far outshines that, of transformation on the part of the hero, who started off as, an inconsequential hobbit in the Shire and turned into a heroic of immense proportion, a hero of immense proportions. And it turns out that the road back home often ends up being the hardest, because when we return home, having been changed by the ordeal, we're different, but home is the same.
Mhm.
And this is the moment that the journey has been about. When we return with the treasure of insight or tangible treasure, it's now up to us to figure out how to give that treasure to the rest of the world that didn't come along in the journey. That's what the whole journey has been about and for. The external things that have been acquired, the internal transformation that's occurred. Now, ultimately, the crux of the journey is this: how
Mm.
can I give that to other people? Um, my belief and my experience with this, as I think has been true for many other people, is that this really is a very accurate description of how we humans are to live in order to become someone we feel genuinely good about and to make our contribution in the world. Um, and I don't remember how I stumbled upon this. It's been a few years ago now, but as I'm sure you've experienced, it's one of those puzzle pieces that showed up to fit into my puzzle right when it seemed most useful and needed. And something I've discovered that's talked about often is how it helps us understand current and past stories. One of the things that I haven't heard as much about that I'm attempting to do something with is how do we use it as a compass and a map moving forward, so that
Mhm.
we can not just respond to involuntary adventures that are thrust upon us, but we can become voluntary adventurers, voluntary frontiersmen, voluntary explorers. And in doing so, evolve ourselves continually into the people that we can be, so that the world can then be benefited by our existence as much as possible.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was going to ask you about is what do you do when you feel like that hero's journey is done, but you're changed? What do you do next? I mean,
The interesting thing about this framework is it exists at all levels of resolution. It's fractal in nature. To use a word that my good friend John on episode 86, that's the episode
okay.
where John and I talk about the hero's journey in a fair amount of detail and through the lenses of our own stories. Um, that's a word he gave me, and I realized, yeah, that's the right word. It's fractal. So it's occurring at all levels and resolutions of our lives. So today, for each of us, has been some version of the hero's journey, and we've interacted with that to greater and lesser levels of success. We've been perhaps in some moments shirking a duty, and another moment rising to the occasion. And then you could look at this week as a hero's journey. You could look at this whole year as a hero's journey. You see where this is headed. Our whole life is a hero's journey. At the first growth camp that we had in October, one of the participants said it's almost like the inner workings of a clock. If you have a clock that you can turn over and you can see all the gears working together, you can see how there's a small one up in the corner doing something, there's a bigger one down in the other corner doing something, but all of them relate to one another. All of them are spinning independently because the teeth of the gears are aligned. They influence the others, and that's a pretty good way of understanding how the hero's journey is at work in our lives at all levels of resolution, in all areas of our lives. There's some opportunity to be engaged in a hero's journey. And all of those hero's journeys are somehow meshing together and creating the story of our lives.
Mm,
What having greater insight about the hero's journey framework itself can do for us, and understanding that this is derived from humanity's deepest longings and aspirations, is that we can then enter into our story more knowledgeably, better equipped. You mentioned earlier, you feel like you're going along and putting things in your backpack. And that's a great way of thinking about it. We can provision ourselves for the journey of our lives and the myriad different heroes' journeys that we're on at any given point in time, um, consciously and proactively when we have this framework in mind. And when we set our mind to being someone and our heart to being someone who, when all is said and done, can look back and say, it wasn't clean, it wasn't pretty, I made a lot of mistakes, but I intended to be a hero in my own story everywhere I went. And the interesting thing about a hero, in modern day culture, the hero is often stripped of many of the qualities that actually make him or her heroic. And in all of the great mythologies and all the stories out of which the hero's journey was derived, the hero is the one who sacrifices the most.
mm,
The hero is the one who benefits others the most.
mm.
And so, lest we think that this is some self-aggrandizing kind of journey, it's deeper than that. It's way better than that, because any self-aggrandizement, any attempts to toot our own horn, um, ultimately are hollow and alienating and self-serving. Um, so, lest we think that the hero is some sort of, you know, glamour project for us, we need to get over that really quickly, because genuine capital A adventures in life are um, require a ton of courage. All the big six that I talk about, you may have heard about on the podcast, these six essential ingredients for becoming someone we genuinely feel good about and living a life we feel outrageously proud of when we die. Courage is number one, and they're in a particular order. Then humility,
Mm.
then truth telling, self permission, self responsibility, and self knowledge. To be a hero in your own story, to be the one that sacrifices the most, you need gobs of courage, and more the farther you go along. You need gobs of humility, gobs of truth telling. So I'll stop there.
No, absolutely. That is totally resonating with me. I love the Lord of the Rings, uh, tie in. I love the movie, but it really helps me understand this as well. And even a step further, I don't know if you've seen the Hobbit series,
Mhm.
but in the Hobbit, Bilbo, who is the one that goes on the journey instead of Frodo, is even what I loved about that is they show his humility even more than Frodo's. Like he's just this simple guy who wants to sit on his porch or sit in his house and drink his tea and have his food in exactly the right place, which I can relate with. I like things a certain way. I like quiet. I don't like disruption. Um, and yet here I am disrupting every spare moment of my life when I'm not at my real job or when I'm not taking care of my kids or with my boyfriend. I'm disrupting it by every day trying to figure out how to do this thing that I've decided I'm now being called to do. And I do it with this humility of like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, but I'm seeking out other people who can help lead the way, who can help show the way, like those mentors that you talked about. And I also have now built a community around it. There's all these people that I feel like are on the journey with me. And when I post, they're liking it and they're commenting and they're telling me, great job. And I feel like that's so important to have that community in there as well. And you feel like you just keep showing up and doing the best you can. And then at some point, you do reach a point where you think, wait a minute, I could actually be that person in the future that's now helping the girl behind me. That was me 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. Um, and so I am kind of at a point now where the other day somebody asked a question on social media, hey, what would you recommend when you start a podcast? And I was like, oh, I have some suggestions because I'm just a little bit further than her. I'm not so far that I can't remember what it was like to take my first steps. I'm just a little further. And so I feel like now I can look back and say, let me help you with this part and this part and this part. Don't do what I did here and those sorts of things. So yeah, it's not just helping myself. It really is. I want to be on this journey, yes, to improve my life and help my life. Secondly, to show my children
Mm.
how I hope that they what they take into their lives, and I hope the way that they look at building their lives is this hero journey mentality, and then help anybody else I can help after that to try to live this way also. So with that, what are you doing to help incorporate this into other people's lives?
If I may, I want to comment just on a few things that I heard from you by way of illustration. Um, you have, in the short amount of time that you've been working on a podcast, you've begun to become more seasoned as a podcaster, as you've gone into the realm of the unknown and faced things you hadn't encountered before and had to summon more courage and humility, which has then made you an ally for others in an earlier stage of their journey, where before you wouldn't have had the same capacity. And so there's the interesting thing about summoning the courage to respond to a call to adventure is that we become more competent as we move through all these trials and challenges and moments of humiliation and humility, and then get the um, surprising reward of passing on that gift to other people and experiencing a depth of fulfillment that we might not have known otherwise. Because it is one of the things we can discover on the hero's journey, if it's a genuine one, is that the ultimate reward, at least on this side of the transition between here and the great beyond, is enriching other people's lives. And we don't live in a culture that currently has a lot to say about that or prizes that very highly. And it's one of the reasons I think we've gone greatly astray is because we've enthroned ourselves as the most important entity in the world, and my happiness and my rights are the most important commodities in the world. And if anyone around me begins to in any way violate or threaten those, then they can be damned. Like they're the enemy. And how isolating and how um, antithetical to really the design I believe that humans have, which is to be interdependent, and to experience the joy of that interdependency. And it's another way of maybe applying that watch gear analogy is as we go on our own hero's journeys and all of those gears mesh with one another, those gears reach outside of that watch face and begin to mesh with others on their journeys. And we begin to see how vitally important it can be for each of us to take really seriously whatever calls to adventure is showing up for us, because it's not just about us. We can't go on a legitimate journey without also beginning to positively influence people around us. And if all these gears of every person in the world are intertwined and interdependent like that, you can imagine how critical it is that each of us takes ours seriously and summons the courage and humility and all the other things necessary to go on them. It's a big deal.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I'm a life coach, but I hate life coachy things, and I find myself saying them all the time. And so I have this real like weird internal conflict with myself, but it's just so true. I mean, each human is immensely important in how they show up and how they don't show up. There's no such thing as a neutral human. And any of us who are skating through life, who've become, to use your language, who are really sleepwalking, who've been lulled to sleep by comforts and conveniences and status quo, um, I want to say wake up,
Mhm.
because you are not doing what you could do for yourself and for the rest of us at best. And it's possible that you're actually doing harm by failing to summon the courage, not harm to yourself acutely, because you're probably aware of the fact that you're shrinking back from the adventures that are calling to you. And every little shrink back from every adventure that calls to us undermines our sense of ourself, our confidence in ourself, our belief in ourself, which then undermines the quality of every interaction. I don't think that's an overstatement. It undermines the quality of every interaction we have with every person around us. And if we're showing up through our own cowardice, and that's not too strong a word, less engaged in our own journeys, then other people are being invited to do similarly.
Mhm.
And so the world is pulling back from the adventure that is collectively ours through all the adventures that are individually ours. If we're doing the opposite, though, and we are summoning whatever courage is necessary, and I say summon courage, not necessarily go out and build the courage, because I think we have precisely enough courage available to us right now if we choose it to take the next step.
Mhm.
It's like if you're in the gym and you're on the bench press and you've never done 150, but you think you've got what it takes today, and you decide to go ahead and do it, and you get it up. You might only do one rep, but that's one rep. You weren't able to do it before. And through more reps, 150 doesn't change, but your capacity to do it changes.
Mhm.
All I need is just enough courage, or in the case of that metaphor, strength to do it. So when we are resolved to summoning the courage that we need in the moment to take the next step, we feel better about ourselves, feeling better. I mean, you can imagine as a mom, when you feel badly about yourself, what your interactions with our kids tend to be like. And we're feeling good about ourselves, how much more positively those interactions go. Um, so it's life coaching. I hate all that stuff, but man, is it true?
It
It
really
is just
is.
so true.
You had a quote. I collect quotes, and one of your quotes on your podcast was, "Our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable." And what you just said, I think about, like, for my son, for example, I worry about him, and I think about a lot of people who have depression or who feel like they don't have a purpose. He's 18, and so he's at that age where he's starting to approach, who am I in life? What is my purpose? What am I going to spend this precious life doing? And I really, really hope, and I'm encouraging him, and that's why I'm writing a book to him, to get him to think about these sort of things and to get him to think about his life in this way, that I feel like, without meaning to use the word depression lightly, because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, and I know that there are many forms of it, but I think there can be a form of feeling depression over not having a purpose or feeling like you
Yeah,
have a place in life.
I agree very much. And like you, I'm not qualified to clinically assess these kinds of things, but I have been through depressive episodes for extensive periods of time. And as I look back on that, I realize also attendant with those depressive episodes were almost toxic levels of sentimentality and nostalgia. The things that I knew and the things that I had known in my past that were comfortable to me I was almost like an emotional hoarder of those things, because I hadn't yet begun to create a compelling vision for the future. And thankfully God persisted with me and persisted in applying enough pressure that I had to begin making some choices. And I thank God that He gave me the capacity in some of those critical moments to choose to move forward courageously, into what has become the most wonderful chapter of our lives over the past 10 or 12 years. When we don't have a compelling vision for the future that's pulling us forward and is um, motivating us to pay the prices necessary to achieve that compelling vision, then I think you're exactly right. I think we experience pretty pervasive forms of depression, of self-loathing, of apathy, of listlessness. And in the current age, I think some of that is happening to the younger generation because of the surrounding cultural context, which has, in my opinion, systematically uh, begun to systematically dismantle all of the ways that we used to legitimately create a sense of identity and purpose, and has replaced all of those old ways of creating identity and purpose with several hot button issues, and said, if you're worth anything, you will sign up for this mission and give your life to it because it's the only one that matters. And then you take a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year old who's trying to find themselves in the world, and they hear that the only thing that matters is saving the planet, or uh, um, redressing racial grievances, or whatever it might be. And they go, well, I'm looking for a purpose. Maybe that's my purpose.
Mm.
And part of what I'm concerned about is that, and I've heard others talk about this, so I'm borrowing it, but it rings true, um, is that it awakens that messianic impulse in the younger generation, which it's there developmentally. It's an appropriate developmental stage, as I understand it, to want to make a difference and to demonstrate themselves to be exceptional. And then they get these two or three agendas out in the world that are the most exceptional agendas one could have and the most heroic. And they short circuit a whole process and co-opt who they could have become. And some people maybe were genuinely meant to do that and
Right.
be part of those bigger world agendas. But I don't think we actually know what we're made for until we have taken the time, as Jordan Peterson says, to put our own house in order. And many of the old constructs that used to be available for forming the initial foundation of identity, like, if we'd been born in Des Moines, Iowa in the 50s, our family did certain things in town and we're known for certain things. We probably went to the one elementary school and then the one middle and the one high school. And you could form a reasonable identity from that small fish pond and it's very small borders. But now people are born into a global fish pond and immediately are able to compare themselves to the entire planet.
Mhm.
Um, and that's neither good nor helpful in the absence of any other mechanism for creating a reasonable identity for themselves. And so I think there's a lot of psychological pain currently that is uh, they're aware of it, but it's often misdiagnosed at best or undiagnosed completely. That's why I have to return to some of these old roads, some of these deeper things to help us understand what is it to be a human? What is it to live a human, to be a human who lives a life they're proud of?
Mm.
What's involved in being someone that I can be proud of and others would want to emulate and upon whom others can depend? Um, well, part of it is capital A adventure, which means being the one who sacrifices most. And in that, we find ourselves as we lose our lives, we gain it. That's not today's message. And so whether it's your 18-year-old, my 14 and 12-year-olds or whomever, how can we adults who need to know better um, be demonstrating to them through how we conduct ourselves that the path to a life we'll be outrageously proud of when we die and becoming someone we feel genuinely good about is paved through courage and humility and hardship and toil and all of the rewards that come as a result.
Mm. Well, those are exactly the questions. So I've always been the type of person that wondered, why are the stars here? What's up? What is this thing about the universe? Why am I here? Who was here thousands of years ago? Like even as a kid, I was asking all these pretty deep questions about life and why we're here and what our purpose is and all those kinds of things. But I took a safe route that I
Hmm.
watched my dad do in work. I did the recipe of life, the went to college, got a safe job, worked it for 20 years. I have a pension. I have 5 more years left until I can draw my pension. And I saw myself walk that path. And when I started writing a letter to my son, it was supposed to be a letter, but it's turned into a book for his, at the time, 16th birthday, which is now turned into his 18th birthday because the number of pages grew. As I started
How is your publisher putting up with this procrastination and just
well, I'm my
pushing the
publisher.
deadline? Yeah.
So I'm giving myself some grace because it's going to be amazing. Um, and those were the questions I started asking is, as I'm writing this book to him, I'm thinking about telling him the kind of life I want him to lead. And it's all the things you're talking about. It's wanting him to really evaluate the kind of life he wants at the end of it. Not just here's something that I say is um it's like our story becomes the choices that we've made along the way, right? It's not that we set out and wrote, this is what I want my story to look like. It's that the story just became whatever choices we made. And a lot of times we made those choices on kind of a multiple choice scale. We didn't even know what all the options were. We didn't give ourselves more options. We just said, okay, based on my knowledge and understanding of my world and the tiny little bubble that I'm in right now, I can pick this or this. And as I look at my 18-year-old and my 14-year-old, I'm like, the world is so much bigger. It's so much bigger. There's so many more options. There are options that haven't even been created yet, but they'll be there when you turn 18. So have your mind be open to that, and I also wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing right now without the experience that I've had and the things that have made me who I am today and the hardships that I went through. And so gosh, it's this really complicated thing where I want my son to realize what I've realized sooner than it took me to realize it. But by the same token, he's going to have to go through his own hardships and journeys and obstacles and dragons and that sort of thing. So it's very weird as a parent to try to explain to him and want to be a little bit of a mentor for him on his own journey, but also to have to step back and say, he's got to fail a few times, to go back to um Frodo and Samwise. There were times where Samwise tried to tell Frodo, you're doing the wrong thing. This is hurting you, or it's turning you bad or whatever. And Frodo didn't listen, and there was not much that Samwise could do.
Very true. And I think one of the things we can do as parents, or anytime we have an opportunity to help those younger than us who are coming along, is to affirm and praise character qualities above who we are, who they are, above and beyond what they do or how they do it. Not that those aren't important, but and all of the great hero stories that we know, and when we look back on our own story and find ourselves conducting ourselves heroically, we realized it was a quality of conduct even
Mhm.
more than it was what we did or how we did it. And so when we can uh, encourage our kids to demonstrate courage, to summon the humility that's necessary to take responsibility for the mistake and to make amends, all those things begin to create heroic qualities in someone so that when involuntary adventures come along, and often they come in the form of a crisis, they've been cultivating the character qualities needed to navigate that with success.
Mm.
And then also we've begun to create in the qualities that will cause them to be more interested in going voluntarily on the adventures that call to them. So I think certainly affirming character qualities is a big one. And it's worth mentioning too that as we talk about adventures, it doesn't need to be Frodo and Samwise. It doesn't need to be epic in that way. For some people listening, today's adventure will be leaving the house
Mm.
because they haven't done that in a while because the outer world frightens them. And if that's a next step for you, that is for you a hero's journey, and you are in that moment summoning immense amounts of courage and humility and all the things you need, and you are becoming the hero in your own story. Some people will have really um, public and large scale heroes journeys that are known to many other people, but that's not many of us. And that's really not up to us to know. Because again, the hero's journey is not a self-aggrandizing, glory seeking enterprise. It is much more altruistic than that. It's much simpler than that, much plainer than that, to be honest with you.
I love that though. So is that something that I was going to have you explain a little bit what growth camp is, but do you are those the things that you work through in growth camp as people going through their own journeys? Do you call it that in growth camp? Do you have somebody pick a hero's journey that they're on and they work through it? Can you explain a little bit what that's about?
Yeah, we started Growth Camp back in October of last year as our first attempt to um, impart the hero's journey framework to people as a compass and a map for their own journeys, to give them a blueprint for their existence that might help them make greater sense of the past, greater sense of the present, and then help them chart a course moving forward that's voluntary and not just reactive and responsive to whatever involuntary adventures come their way. And so we had one in October, we had another one in January. We've been kind of iterating over time. We plan to have a few more before we kind of do a grand analysis of what's working and not working, what's not working. Um, and there's a little bit of just content delivery. Here's what the hero's journey is. Here's where you see it with Disney and such. Here's where you see it in all of the old mythologies. And then we try as quickly as we can to turn the corner into what about you? Um, how does this resonate with you? How does this land with you? What does it mean to you? How do you understand your story a little bit differently now that you have the lens through which to view it of the hero's journey? And then we begin to ask them to consider the various calls to adventure that may be presenting themselves to them now. Sometimes people realize that they're in the middle of a particular hero's journey, and gaining access to the hero's journey framework helps them get their bearings. Oh, here's where I am. That's one of the great advantages of the hero's journey is that um, the lion's share of the hero's journey happens under past the threshold between the known and the unknown world, and in this land of the unknown, the underworld. And very often, when we get into those stretches of the journey, we doubt ourselves, we second guess, we think we're not up to it. Maybe I took a wrong turn, and sometimes we can take wrong turns. That's part of the journey too. But really, more often than not, if it is a journey that's genuinely ours to take, and not one that is you know, sort of some self-inflicted or some because very often many of us come into adulthood attempting to go on a journey that someone else has said we need to go on. And that's part of our wake-up call somewhere in our 30s or 40s. And we kind of look around and go, how did I get here? What's going on? Maybe you can relate to that. So as long as it is, as far as you know, a journey that's yours, when we get to those moments where, like Frodo, we want to turn back on we're on the side of Mordor and don't think we can go on any farther. I always get Frodo and Bilbo mixed up, so I'm probably totally screwing up the whole
No,
thing.
you got it.
What we can do in those moments is go, no, hold on. This is what it feels like when I'm in the underworld. This is how it's supposed to feel. Nothing's wrong, even though chaos surrounds me and I don't know if I can make it and I don't know what to do. This is what it's supposed to feel like. And really, more often than not, the simple encouragement we need is to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Just keep going. Um, and then if you keep going long enough with your eyes open, so many more courage and humility and truth telling, typically you come out the other end. You're going to be banged up. But typically the bangs and bruises that we get on a hero's journey are of the refining sort.
Mm,
They have created in us qualities of character and depth of insight that wasn't there before and could only have been gained through that means. And it's no overstatement to say that comfort kills. Comfort kills, period.
yes.
When we enjoy comfort as a destination rather than a means to an end. And it's one of the things that I see happening in Western culture is we have become so accustomed to the comfort and convenience that we have worked really hard to create. And I'm not in any way maligning that because it's wonderful. I don't want it to go away. I love the fact that I've got this wonderful office on the Yampa River and I'll go home to my wife and boys and we'll be in a dry, warm. I mean, I love all of that. I don't want that to go away. I think in many respects, we as a nation have earned that based upon the environment we were able to create within which these kinds of things were possible. But when we begin to enjoy comfort as a destination and not as a means to a greater destination, then it begins to kill us. And it's not a benign thing any longer. And so I have an episode of my podcast where I use a mountain climbing metaphor and try to highlight how absurd it would be to get to base camp on a multi-stage expedition style big mountain climb and think that you'd arrived.
Oh,
if you saw a climber do that, you would think they're oxygen deprived. Something's going on here. Like, no, you've just gotten to base camp. You've just gotten to your starting point. Base camp has the amenities. It's got the kitchen tent. It's got, all of the great bathroom facilities that better than you're going to have higher up on the mountain. And if we mistake that for the summit, then we have robbed ourselves of the ultimate prize. But many of us, I think, are doing that. And, you and I who have ourselves experienced an awakening and are attempting to help others, part of our hero's journey is figuring out how to continue to invite others into this greater journey and to use their extravagant resourcing, because no matter what condition you live in the United States, on some level, it is extravagant resourcing compared to much of the rest of the world. How
Right.
can we use that extravagant resourcing to take us on adventures of wonder
Mm.
and innovation and things that will help the rest of the world in ways that other people aren't resourced to?
Right.
Um, so our adventures are relative to our situation and our capacity in the moment. But as we go on, whatever the next adventure is, we increase our capacity.
Hmm.
Um, and we've got to slap ourselves awake out of the stultifying, deadening influence of comfort.
Mm.
Super hard to do. I mean, cold plunges are all the rage these days. And I look at them like, yeah, that's probably be really good for me. But I like a hot shower in the morning.
Yep.
I'm just keeping so all of us
Same.
have this thing that just, I'll just stay comfortable. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. But
Yeah.
it kills
Yeah.
us.
It does. I have found it's kind of like working out. Every time I move through certain steps that I've been afraid of, that I didn't know how to do, that I'm like, oh, I can't do that. I don't know how to, I don't even know where to start. Well, sometimes you don't start at A, you start at, the preface to A. You just take the tiniest next step that you can take. And every time I take that step, I'm like, oh, I did that. I did that. I figured that out. Okay, what's the next one? And I kind of get excited and I'm like, I can do this. You start out in the gym lifting 5 pounds and then you can lift 10 and then 15 and whatever. I feel the same. It strengthens you on the
Hmm.
inside to face these things that you didn't know how to do, that you were terrified to do. And then you do them and you're like, okay, life's not as scary as I thought it was. That thing is not as scary as I thought it was. And now I
Hmm.
can do the next thing on my list because now all those things are behind me that I thought I was never capable of doing. It really does strengthen you. So, had I never done any of those things, I would be walking around living this life as the person I was before all those experiences, who was not as strong as I am today.
Well, it's an old adage, but it bears repeating. It is that, there's no simple or easy path in life. There's only degrees of hard. So we get to pick our hard. We can pick hard now, or we can pick hard later, but we don't get to avoid hard. And
Right.
hard now might be continuing to grab ourselves by the scruff of the neck and move into the discomfort of a new frontier, where, as you say, we fortify ourselves, we strengthen ourselves from within, so that when the inevitable involuntary adventures in the form of crisis come along, we're better able to rise to that occasion. Or we can stay where we are and coast until such time as an involuntary adventure slash crisis shows up. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and of what sort shows up. And if we have not chosen to move forward courageously, then we are left with very minuscule resources to
Mm.
rise to that occasion. And sometimes those floods overwhelm us. Um, and if you've not been on, more and more adventures and been in that habit, you also have not been accumulating allies along the way who can be depended upon in those kinds of moments, nor have you been able to be an ally to someone else. And your network of your safety net is much, uh, the I don't know, the holes in the safety net are a lot bigger. You can fall through, and the safety net is not as large or robust.
Yeah.
Um, but on any given day, it's very easy to forget these things. It's very easy to just go through the motions. It was mortality that woke me up uh, when in 2015, 2013, when my brother-in-law got a grim cancer diagnosis, and I was smoking heavily, drinking heavily, trying to cope with anxiety in all kinds of really dumb ways. Um, I had a wonderful wife and two beautiful boys, and here he was, 38 and dying.
Mm.
And I looked down at my gut literally and figuratively. I was like, Petty, I mean, you can't control when you die, but you're not helping yourself stay alive. And within 9 months, I was from back down to 185 from 250. I
Wow.
was beginning to um, resolve some of my poor coping habits. And I look back and realize that set me on a whole new trajectory that persists to this day. And that's not tooting my own horn at all. That's tooting the power of mortality's horn to
Right.
whip our butts into gear.
Right.
Because how often do we think about all the little hurts, hangups, and habits that get in our way from making big changes? What I found was when mortality rode into my life, all
Mm.
of that evaporated. And it was like, what needs to be done? Okay, that's it. I'm on it. I'm doing it. And I mean,
Yep.
I was up at 5 every morning, working my butt off, just completely transform me. So if there was anything that, we could engage as affluent Westerners today that might serve us well, it would be confronting the reality of our mortality. I find it's common, even as you did earlier on in the conversation, mentioned, it may have been before we started recording, but you're talking about wanting to have funeral celebrations before you died, and
Mhm.
that's kind of morbid. And it's so interesting because I think that's just awesome now that I'm doing it. I don't think that's morbid at all, but we almost feel apologetic for bringing up those kinds of things as if bringing up the only thing in this life that is absolutely guaranteed is somehow uncool or unfair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but what I have found, and I would imagine you're beginning to find, is that when we confront the one thing in this life that is guaranteed with courage and in voluntary fashion, it begins to bring us to life. And it's doing that for me. And I hope our listeners today will consider doing that for themselves as well. It's going to
I
happen.
love
It's just a matter of when and how.
That's right. I love that. Yeah, that's what I started thinking about that got me on this journey. And I've heard you say, imagine if you woke up and found out you had 5 years to live. And it's like you were talking about, you'll make it happen when it's important enough to you, and when not changing becomes too uncomfortable. When you can no longer not make the change. And if you found out you were dying in a year or 5 years, you would do what it took. You would do what it took to make the changes you need to make. So I love everything that you're doing. I love all the things that you talk about on your podcast. I hope that people will listen to it. I have listened to many, many, many episodes, and I get something out of every single one. The one thing I would like to ask you before we stop talking is, I have to admit that I get a little bit of stress now over the fact that I have all these things I want to do and accomplish. And I do feel like I'm on a hero's journey. It's exciting and fun, but I know that my time is short on life and I can only do so many things. Do you have any insight, or like, have you experienced that? Anything that you can help me, where now I have this stress that I want to get it all done before my life is over?
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And it was actually a very clear point in my own cultivation of this practice. I remember a period of, I don't know, it may have been 4, 5, 6 months where I felt that same kind of stress, like, okay, I'm awake, I'm gonna die. So what do I do? And then I began to ask myself questions like, what's the best thing to do with this day?
Yes.
And sadly, those are, in my opinion, unanswerable questions,
Mm.
and they're unproductive to pose them. And so I realized at that point that I was beginning to hit the outer limit of the value of the mortality mindset in that way. And when I began to experience this unproductive stress related to it, it was time to back off. It was time to let go a little bit and
Mhm.
to acknowledge in humility and with courage that there are some things I can do and know, and there's many things that I can't do and I can't know. And so when I get out to that bleeding edge where it's causing stress and it's becoming unproductive, I've got to back off some of the courage and humility necessary to know that I don't know what the best thing to do today is. I don't know what the most productive use of time would be. What do I know? What's the next thing I could do? And we begin to do that instead of pushing for the best, the most. And I'm an idealist, and so that language comes naturally to me, but it can ultimately end up being pretty unproductive. So I would say just keep going. You're to me at least sample size of one, that's sort of a known developmental point in the journey. as we continue to figure out how to use the mortality mindset in our own lives effectively. And then I would say one other thing, and not everyone will resonate with this or agree with this, and I will say the reason why I find great hope and joy in the hero's journey is because I'm in a relationship with the designer of the journey. And I have, by God's grace, submitted and surrendered to his lordship. And I believe he is the author of this whole story of humanity. And he's the author of my story. And it's not for me to know the outcome or the ending. It is for me, however, to do my best, to do what I can to bring my loaves and fishes to the occasion so that he can do with them as he pleases. And so I find great hope and power and peace and comfort in knowing that ultimately I have some responsibility in this journey, but the God that created me has ultimate responsibility for getting out of me what he wants. And so I commend anyone who has not yet plumbed those kinds of things to consider them, because I believe one of the reasons why things like the hero's journey resonates so deeply with us is because we're tapping into an innate God-given
Mm.
programming for his creation.
Mm.
And it behooves us to go a little further and figure out who's behind all this. And then once we can get to know the author of this blueprint, then um, we've got a good thing going.
I love that. Well, that is wonderfully, wonderfully helpful. And what a perfect way to end this. Um, can you share all of your places that people can follow along with this and listen to you and hopefully start learning more about this hero's journey and how they can apply it to their lives?
AndrewPettyCoach.com gives you kind of the skinny on all my stuff and what I'm doing and how you can connect with me. And then the podcast is always available on the website, AndrewPettyIsDying.com. And on all the usual podcast platforms. I've just gone from publishing every 2 weeks to now publishing once every 4 weeks in order to prioritize some other things, but it's still going to be coming out. And it's now available on my YouTube channel. I've just released the first 2 video episodes as well, which I'm really excited about, having figured out how to do that. I just turned 50, so feeling like I'm still technically savvy on some front feels great. But I hope you'll check it out on YouTube and give me feedback on your experience with both the production side of things and the content itself. And then on all the socials at andrewpettycoach.com. And I'm there every once in a while. I'm not the most prolific user, but doing what I can.
I was going to tell you happy late birthday because I did hear you say that it was your 50th. And I have started calling it, instead of a midlife crisis, a half-life awakening. So
Perfect.
I'll give you
I love
that.
that.
And I would be honored if you would actually sign off how you sign off on your podcast, because I've gotten so used to hearing it and I love it every time I hear it. So would you do that?
Absolutely. Remember, you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So get after it.
I love it. Thank you so much.
My
Well,
pleasure.
thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. Make sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you get notified of new episodes. Also, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and sign up for my newsletter at shakemeawake.com. I hope you'll tune in again.